running. I'm going to let me sit right over there. Oh yeah, I'm not quite ready. I'll get him. Yeah. Good morning, good morning. For those in the hallway, we're in here. Gary, grab people behind you. This is not that loud. Maybe I have volume. All right, we have some more seats up here in the second row and first row for people to settle in. Please join us. All right, and right on cue. Good morning, everybody. How we doing? All right, well, I'm Bryan Agretti. I'm the chairman of City First Foundation, City First Enterprises, and the CEO of City First Bank. And we are really, really excited to do this morning with all of you. And I'm particularly excited to hear from the guests that we have brought here today and learn a little bit more about the future of impact investing and particularly how it can and should be localized. So our title today, The Future of Impact Investing is Local. This is actually the first of a series of 3 impact forums that we're holding this fall. It's a little different than we've done in the past. We've done our large-scale conference each year, but we decided to mix it up just to keep ourselves on our toes this year and break it up into 3s and have more concentrated and in-depth discussion around particular topics. So in this particular one, we really want to try and get individuals to share some of their unique insights and lessons learned as we are collectively trying to pave the way toward greater social and economic equity. A couple of housekeeping items. You all should have agendas in your chair or out front. A couple things there. There's bios on all of the speakers, so you probably won't hear the introduction with the lengthy bio. Just refer down to the bios in the on the sheets, and you can really see the reference points from which they are coming. Secondly, for those of you who tweet, and I know my first guest tweets quite a bit and with some very, very interesting things, feel free to use pound City First, as well as, if it's a particular speaker you're referencing, we've got their handles there as well. The flow of the day. So we're going to have what we call coffee and conversation. Not sure I think we might have run out of coffee, but we'll make do. I had mine in a little earlier. It was espresso, so hey, watch out. And then we're going to go into a data presentation. We think it's always important to ground our discussions with data. And so we'll have a data presentation, and then we'll have our panel discussion, which will be moderated by our own Lisa Green Hall. And then, of course, a lunch reception. And in a lot of ways, after you've gotten fed with all this information, that becomes the most important part, where you get an opportunity to connect with one another, drill a little deeper, get a card, figure out what you're going to do tomorrow or this afternoon with the knowledge you've acquired. Before I go any further, I think I really am very excited to acknowledge our supporters and sponsors for this series and this particular event. First and foremost, the Bernstein Companies, Holland & Knight, and J.P. Morgan Chase. And then you see many, many other names up there: Bank of America, Cohn Resnick, SunTrust, U.S. Bancorp, the CDC, Wells Fargo, Promontory, Interfinancial, FIS, and RapidScale. All of these organizations have stepped forward for City First Foundation to be able to bring you this type of dialogue and discussion, and we are quite grateful for their partnership. Good morning, Rachel. Who's in the room, right? I mean, you know, if you came in here, you're kind of wondering, well, who would show up for this? And let me give you a little bit of context. We've got investment managers, we've got think tanks and research organization heads, we've got family foundations and advisors to foundations. We've got officials from local and federal government agencies. We've got policymakers. We've got corporate leaders. Obviously, we have individual impact investors. And then, of course, all of the speakers whose bios you see. So part of our job is to bring together a unique cross-section so that we can have these conversations. So at City First, generally, and at City First Foundation, we fervently believe that every individual, every family, and every community should have the opportunity and the access to capital and resources that will allow them to improve their well-being and prosper. But more than that, we believe it's capital as a tool, and particularly that we are part of the solution, and we must be part of the solution. So that's what grounds us in this dialogue. Today, why are we here? We're going to learn a little bit more about impact investing, particularly as it applies to community investing and local investing. We want you to feel empowered that you too can be an impact investor at your place of work, if that's your field, or as an individual. There's many openings, many on-ramps for you to participate. And we also want you to know that you can direct your activities to really a more equitable and inclusive world in impact investing. And I think that's a real important thing that we're going to hear a little bit about. We'll talk a little bit about why local impact investing matters and talk with influence leaders who have the ability to move the needle forward for us. So what are we solving for? We're at a time where everything, in some senses, seems completely out of control. Economic inequities have multiplied, and they're compounded and paralleled with racial economic gaps. We think that's worth talking about, and we think it's worth bringing into the dialogue and the conversation when we're talking about impact investing. At City First, one of the primary problems we're trying to solve alongside you is how we can shrink those social and economic and racial disparities within the city of Washington. And really, the city of Washington is just a lens, but it's a very powerful one for this issue. In Washington, D.C., it's particularly powerful, the extent of the racial and demographic inequities. We talk about a number a lot. I think I opened a conference 2 years ago with the number 81. And we sat on that for a while. We let it sit on our heads and said, what does that mean? And we talked about it was the difference in household wealth between an African-American family in the city and a Caucasian family. 21 times. And as we absorb that, we begin to realize what that means in terms of business formation, housing, job opportunities, education, and how dramatic that gap is. So let's sit with that again. 81. Think about what that means. So that's why we're here. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to help fix the problem. And we're going to start with really a guest I'm excited to chat with and have a conversation with. His name is Rodney Foxworth. You have his bio in your materials. He is he's many things, but one of the things he's a prolific writer and tweeter. And in fact, our own Lisa Greenhall said, he's my favorite person to follow on Twitter. So I'm giving you a plug, Rodney, on your Twitter account. But I'm going to tell you, there's going to be some things he's going to challenge you on. And so we'll learn a little bit about our own. With Baltimore, D.C., our own, Rodney Foxworth, who's now out in Oakland. Just got in last night. I understand he's went through multiple cities doing his work, which we'll learn a little bit about. Rodney, why don't you join me on the stage? Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Make sure I have the appropriate logo.
We're all well taught by our marketing and communication teams. So I want to read something here. It's a description. Is that on? Okay, good. It's a description of you. So this is kind of a bit of an intro. Rodney Foxworth is a nonprofit executive, social entrepreneur, impact investing advisor, and philanthropy consultant. He's founded, led, and advised numerous social impact and economic development ventures. You're now an executive at Bally. But I want to go back to that descriptive, those 4 categories, right? Because that's a lot. That's a mouthful. I'm very impressed. But which of those is the most meaningful to you as we go through that? Nonprofit executive, social entrepreneur, impact investing advisor, philanthropy consultant.
So really quickly, and can you hear me? Good to go? So I'm really happy to be back in the area because, as I was explaining to Bryan, having moved to the Bay Area in January, I'm readjusting to this humidity. I hadn't experienced it for several months, so I appreciate being back. And as Bryan pointed out, what's that? Sorry, hopefully we'll break. But as Bryan pointed out, I actually grew up and did much of my work north in Baltimore, which has a lot of similarities to DC, of course, and we'll get into the conversation. But to explicitly answer the question, Bryan, I actually don't feel that any of those descriptors really are the most appropriate because for me, and I think as we get into the dialogue a bit, it's really sort of advocate, particularly for the communities that have been most marginalized in our current economy, right? And so the people in Baltimore, the people in DC, and communities like our cities in which wealth has been exclusive. And in fact, a lot of wealth has been established sort of on the backs of folks. So I really think of myself as much as an advocate as possible, and think a lot about one of our peers, Mike McAfee over at PolicyLink, thinking about his work as representing all the individuals that are living in poverty and being able to advocate for them and challenge the current system and power dynamics. So really that's the most appropriate, I think, for me when I wake up in the morning. I think of myself as an advocate.
An advocate. So let's stay with that a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about Baltimore, both your upbringing, but also your professional experiences there. And I'm really curious how that affected your worldview. Now you're out in Oakland. We'll talk a little bit about Bally and what your charge is there. But tell me a little bit about Baltimore and your worldview as we're beginning to learn a little bit about it in this dialogue.
Of course. And I think for many folks who may have grown up in DC or have grown up in similar places, Baltimore is a city that is, quite frankly, exemplifies many of the challenges that we're moving forward with across the country, right? In terms of what it looks like when you have a community that has experienced mass incarceration, dealing with the realities of post-industrialization, many sort of challenges that we're all experiencing and dealing with. I'll give you one quick thing that really helped shape my worldview on many things. when I was in the Baltimore City public school system, and this has not really changed in many public school systems, which, by the way, in America, we're now a majority of people of color students in our public school systems. Baltimore, which is a city that is 64% African American and about 24% poverty level. The school systems, and just as a data point, is 90% African American, 90% low income, right? And so when you look at these kind of dynamics that we're seeing in our public institutions, that's something that, for me, having experienced that, and when I was in school, particularly in my early years, the third and fifth grade students in Baltimore City, over 2/3 of them were reading below grade level, right? I happened to be one of the ones that did not. But just to really contextualize when you come into that kind of system and have that kind of experience, and despite that, really reckoning with the systems of the public education in which one of my teachers actually in third grade accused me of cheating and not being able to read. I discovered years later that many of my peers, including a Rhodes Scholar, Stanford grad, and others, were dealing with similar issues, right? As African American men coming out of public school. So I think that shapes a lot of the work. And again, it goes back to advocating for the kind of change that I think is required.
Systemic issues, without a doubt, being a bit. And we're going to come back to that at the end. I want to ask you a little bit about your views on systemic issues. But again, just to lay the table a little bit, set the table for the audience here. Your current work, what are you doing out in Oakland? What's Bali, if you could, in a concise way, share a little bit about what your charge is right now.
And so I'm out in Oakland, and Bali, though, actually serves North America or the U.S. and Canada, right? And so we actually have a few Bali connected folks here. Harold Pettigrew, I know many folks know Raj. And so really our work at Bali is to be able to support and equip leaders with the skills and resources and relationships, really, to be able to build more economically empowered communities, principally through entrepreneurship, but really having a specific view on what business ownership looks like. So are we looking at things like cooperative ownership? Are we looking at ways to really advance economic equity through business ownership for African American, Latino households? Are we looking at rural communities that have really been extracted from, really have been disserved in terms of our current economic system? And so we really take priorities on terms of who are the most marginalized communities, how do we actually leverage business and entrepreneurship as a lever for creating change.
So let's connect that to kind of our topic and our headline today, if you will. So I want to talk a little bit, and I think our moderator, Lisa Hall, will talk a little bit about defining impact investing, which means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But I want to, and you can please comment on that, what it means to you. But I want to ask a little bit about the local aspect. So you're running a national organization. You're popping across the country, working with leaders in the space. Why local and localism? What does that have to do with impact investing?
So I'm going to first sort of point out that for any kind of change to happen, you really need the individuals and communities that are closest to the actual challenges to be able to deconstruct and determine what are ways of moving forward. So when we look at local, it's clear that if you're someone that is working deliberately in DC, maybe have a set of relationships and experiences that allow you to help shape the way that you go about your work, that's actually really important, right? And it's the idea, and one of the things that gets lost when you think about local is also really the aspect of being self-reliant and actually being able to establish an economic power base in your community, right? And so when we look at our current American economy, for example, we really deprioritize local business. We deprioritize the opportunities for communities that own locally, right? So whether it's in our policy, whether it's in the way our philanthropy oftentimes works, we sort of don't look at the context for the benefits that individuals with a certain knowledge set and skill set and understanding of how communities work, right? Even when you think about the role of community organizers and others within a place, that can be really impactful in terms of informing the type of businesses and the type of way that capital can flow in the community.
So when you, just taking that a step forward, so when you talk about some of the local actors, how important are business owners, be they minority business owners or folks from previously from or currently from low wealth environments, uh, local nonprofits. Talk a little bit about how those fit into the ecosystem that's so critical for local change.
So again, local business ownership is critical for so many reasons. We're at a point right now, and we're at about a 30 to 40-year low in new business creation in the U.S. Let that sink for a little bit, right? Because we're supposed to be a place of innovation, business, entrepreneurship, but we've really sort of taken away the ability or the access points for so many local businesses and communities to be able to access the opportunities in which they can thrive. Right? And so from a policy perspective, that's something that we all need to engage with and understand really critically. And the importance of it is when you really extract, when you take away a community's ability to self-determine and be able to engage local businesses in ways that keeps wealth in the place, you sort of see what we're living in. We're living in Baltimore. We're living in DC. We're living in so many communities. So that's really the importance, right, to have community-defined local ownership.
But I don't understand. The stock market, I heard this morning, is at an all-time high. Everybody's wealthy. Everybody's got jobs, particularly in the African-American community. The lowest it's ever been. Connect the dots for me.
Everyone has jobs here, right? You got jobs to hand out, right? Is that it?
No, I guess that's a little facetious, but if you could connect or or speak to the disconnect between what's happening or what's being touted for those who have the means to help and perhaps those in most need of help. Because we're really talking about that conduit between the two, be it from a power base, be it from an economic base or otherwise. Can you just spend a minute on that?
Yeah, and let me reframe it too, because I don't look at it in terms of needing help, right?
Good, very good.
It's an investment. And so I think when you really look at the national narrative moving forward, in particular, we understand that the U.S. is going to become a majority people of color country, right? And we also understand that if current policy or economic trends continue, African-American households, median wealth, it's already astronomically, the chasm, the racial wealth chasm is significant. But we're going to see these sort of things occur more. And actually places like DC and Baltimore actually have a lot to teach, right, in terms of what does it look like when you have a majority of people of color place or community and the wealth divide has such an impact across that place in a significant way. The reality of it is that most people that, I'm thinking like Harold, most of the folks that his community at Wycliffe serves, they're not in the stock market, right? Their employees don't have stock, don't own stock. I mean, it's quite irrelevant to them. And so the disconnect between the financialization of a market versus the real economy that we live in every single day, the people that we're in service to actually live through, there's a significant gap. And when you think about the opportunities moving forward, if we don't invest in communities, we're all going to be impacted by it. It's not, when you live in a Baltimore, you live in a DC, you live in a Cincinnati or these communities, you live out what happens when you're not investing in local business ownership, you're not investing in possibility for people. You see it, you live it. And so I think it's one of the things we need to really reframe, to think less about helping individuals and communities and realizing that we're actually a part of the community, right? And that we all will benefit and fall on the strengths of that community. So I think that's a really important framing.
No, I agree. That's fantastic. And again, going back to the wealth gap, that's part of, I'm asking, it's part of the issue that prevents full participation, if you will, in the economic upsides that perhaps the country or portions of the country are enjoying, be it in the stock market, be it in housing, be it in small business formation, many of the issues that we're looking at. So you've been, we talked last week, I think it was a week and a half, and you're going on this tour, or going, you're working and you're traveling up and down the coast. I think you had 5 stops in 4 days or something insane like that. What were you doing? Who were you talking to? And more importantly, what were they talking about? What were you learning about? What were you teaching, perhaps? Just high level kind of.
Yeah, so I'm going to tie this actually back to your question about impact investing or how we define it. So it's a broad conversation, right? And I think the work at Bali is really specific in terms of how do we leverage capital in ways that are equitable for communities, right? And then when I think about like being an advocate, for us, it's really how do we make things as accessible as possible for entrepreneurs, business owners, communities, And so we have this concept that we've been kind of thinking about. I framed it in a piece that I wrote for the Chronicle not too long ago, Chronicle of Philanthropy not too long ago, restorative investing, right? And this is something that's come from one of our board members and fellows, Alpha Demlash at Rising Tide in Newark, and another woman, Amaka Agbo, who's in Oakland. And this concept is really about how do you leverage capital in ways that democratize it and also really prioritize equity and justice. And so when I think about the folks that coined the term impact investing, which, by the way, I mean, that was coined 10 or so years ago by like Jed Emerson and Anthony Buck Levine, but impact investing has been happening for quite a while, right? CDFIs, community development finance, that is impact investing. And I would note, though, that every investment has an impact, right? Whether negative, positive. And so one of the things that when we have, some of the conversations that I've had in the last week or so, so for example, I was in Philadelphia, at a similar convening for Philly, and the conversation there was, hey, as one CEO of a foundation noted, that they've moved over half of their investment portfolio into impact investing. And she posed a question that changed the entire tenor of the room and the conversation. And she said, but is that any of that going to have a meaningful impact on the African-American communities that are in Philadelphia, right? Is that going to do anything as I'm continuously having this conversation with my investment committee and my board about making sure that we're level set, that we're ensuring that we're being responsible investors? How's it actually going to have a meaningful impact, in the African-American and low wealth communities that she's in service to? And and she was deeply emotional about that question, right? And so I think that is really what a lot of us in this room are struggling with. And so how to pair capital in ways that really are in support of, and again, not helping communities, but really investing in ourselves in ways that we're ensuring that, for example, we talk about the wealth gap for African Americans, how that deeply impacts new business creation, right? How we're going to have we're eliminating so many opportunities for new business creation in communities like DC and Baltimore and Philadelphia, but not really addressing the racial wealth gap and leveraging the existing capital that we have.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think one of the things that is quite positive is that we really are seeing the foundations think and look differently about the ultimate impact and struggling with the very same questions that I think some of us in the room may be struggling with about how you really create ultimate systemic change that again, it's all of us by benefiting all of us. So there's a quote here I want to just read to the audience. I was doing some reading both across my Twitter feed, but there was an article you had written, I think it was earlier in the year. The title of the article was How Impact Investing Can Chart an Equitable Way Forward for All Americans. So I thought, wow, bingo. The other articles you wrote were really all also directly relevant, but I love that title. But then it was the quote, and let me read this to you, and I'll go slowly because I want you to really absorb it. Dominant belief driving impact investing is that the market principles of capitalism should be applied to social change. That belief overlooks the many ways in which market forces create injustice and inequality in the first place. You got some supporters on that. Talk about that.
That's a heavy question to end with. So again, the reality of it is when we're working in the communities that we work with, we've sort of, and I want to point to mainstream impact investing, right? So again, I've had these conversations with a lot of folks, and when you see what has happened in terms of how we look at and how we define impact and change, it's not really defined by communities themselves, right? It's not defined by a lot of the folks that we work with in the BALIC network, right? And so I just want to bring that up. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this that really directly tie into the work of a lot of the folks in our BALIC community. So in that piece, I cited the work of Deborah Fries in Boston at the Boston Impact Initiative. And really, she's been going through her own journey, right? She's a high net worth individual who is really grasping with the facts of how she accumulated her own wealth and how individuals in Boston, particularly African Americans, were not afforded the same type of opportunities and privileges, right? And so by going on her own journey, she's been really a part of a community organizing effort more broadly. However, she's really been leveraging her capital in ways to invest directly into, not necessarily solving, but having some positive impact on the racial wealth gap in Boston, right? And so by doing that, she's created a structure for her investment portfolio that really privileges the individuals and residents in Boston above investors, right? And so this is really a structure in which she's really working with a lot of community organizations to identify the opportunities to invest in businesses, really providing cooperative ownership models, really creating a different kind of way so that residents in Boston have achieved both economic and racial equity.
Thank you, Ryan. I think it's important for us to sit with that question as well. I think many organizations are thinking about the broader implications of how they're structured, how they're, if you will, attacking the issue of closing the gap. But that's not the last question, despite the flag in the back, because I really want to know what you're excited about. Oh, look, they cut the power off on me.
I knew that. I thought we were getting
Who do these folks work for?
I know how that feels.
But seriously, what are you excited about? If you can just, particularly in the impact investing space, what are you seeing that's really, really exciting?
So what I'm really excited about is really the work that's happening, and not to just make this about Bali folks, but I'm seeing so much happening in terms of really wrestling with and acting on this question of how do we actually leverage capital that goes to work for communities. So even that emotional sort of out like that what happened in Philly, I was actually inspired by that because I'd seen a foundation executive that was frustrated in anguish, right? And really was putting themselves out there to say, I'm really questioning the way I'm going about my work, right? And which is something that we all need to do, and I'm inspired by that. And then I'm inspired by the kind of work that things are happening, what Harold is doing, what people like Jessica Norwood are doing with the Runway Project, with many folks in the room I think have supported, which is really addressing the racial wealth gap as it relates to African American ownership of business and how that transpires. So there's a number of things that I'm really inspired by. I'm inspired by really the shifts that I've seen over the last few years, even in my own home place of Baltimore, about prioritizing racial equity and leveraging capital in powerful ways that really 3 years ago I wouldn't have seen. Right?
Thank you, Rodney. I'm inspired as well by your words, your presence, as well as folks in this room and some of the things we're beginning to see. Thank you. We appreciate you joining us. Conversation across a variety of topics. We do have some more space up here in the front to really set the frame or set multiple frames for the rest of the discussions today. I'm really excited to have our data presentation and our next speaker, Rachel Bass, who's the manager of research at GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. She is, now you see how sharp of a turn we're making here real quick. She is she's an expert in impact investing, but particularly around financial data. She's going to share some of her conclusions, some of her analysis within the industry, really with a spotlight on local investing and some of the firms that are attacking this work in a very, very powerful way. So let's welcome Rachel Bass to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and it's really great to be here today. I'll be pulling a lot of insights from this report, which we have somewhere, but in the meantime, I thought I would just share a little bit with you about the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. So we are a nonprofit organization based in New York City. I have the great privilege of being based here. And we seek to increase the scale and effectiveness of impact investing, both in the US and globally. And I thought I would share our definition of impact investing as well, which is investments into projects, companies, or funds with the intention to generate a positive social or environmental result alongside financial returns. So there's a few components of this definition that I think are helpful to point out. The first is there needs to be this intentionality to create a positive change. And one way that we see that happening in practice is the commitment to measuring and reporting impact results. The second key component is that there does need to be a financial return. So we're not talking about grants, but we are talking about returns anywhere from competitive market rate returns to capital preservation. And there's a really critical role of capital along this spectrum. I'll walk through a couple of our core programs and then we'll dive into the data. So we have a membership of about 275 impact investing organizations and champions of impact investing based in over 40 countries around the world. So this includes fund managers, foundations, banks, pension funds, and many others, including a large CDFI contingent. We also have the IRIS and Impact Measurement and Management Program, which maintains the IRIS system, including a catalog of over 500 social, environmental, and financial performance metrics, as well as guidance on how to set an impact strategy and how to arrive at the right core metrics to understand progress in achieving that strategy. The third is our initiative for institutional impact investment, and we provide on-ramping resources and materials for institutional investors that are interested in entering the field. And then lastly is the research program where I sit, and we produce data and insights on the landscape of impact investing activities and players, their performance in terms of both financial return and impact, and different strategies they use to invest their capital. And so I'll pull from some research insights today. And so I thought I would start by just sharing some background that we produced a few years ago on different ways of understanding the landscape of US community investments. And so here's our definition of US community investing, so investing into low-income and marginalized communities in this country. And so you'll see it's a subset of the broader definition of impact investing, and one that's really critical. As was noted on the discussion already, this is a market that's been around for decades and one that can really inform other investors around the world. So we're eager to draw from their insights. We find that there's three main investment sectors from that landscape, so affordable housing, education, and of course access to finance. But there's a lot of other ways that investment capital can wield change here in the US. And so one of the efforts that we did a couple years ago was try to understand the different products that are available in US community investing. And so we found, as you can see here, that there's a lot of assets in credit unions and banks, as well as capital in community loan funds. And so that's what we'll really dive into today, because this year we published a new report, this one, on the financial performance of impact investing through private debt. This study was produced in partnership with Symbiotics, which is a Swiss asset management and research firm, and it includes two segments of analysis. The first are what we termed private debt impact funds. These are mostly emerging market focused, investing in financial services, and especially microfinance. And the second, which is what we'll focus on today, are the community development loan funds. So this segment of the market here, that's investing here in the US. These are all CDFI certified, and they're investing at various levels. So some are national, some are state level, some are county level, and others are at the city level. Altogether, we have data from 102 CDLFs, which is a really nice sample to understand this market. We gathered this data in partnership with the Opportunity Finance Network, which is a really great partner in this endeavor. One, in gathering data, and two, in really distilling the insights and understanding what we're looking at. So we're really grateful for that partnership as well. Just a little bit of background on who's in this sample. So these are all loan funds. They're structured as loan funds. They're issuing debt to local communities. Their median assets under management is $25 million, so they're relatively small. And they're seeking to have a number of different types of impact and following these three main objectives that I've listed here. So first is investing into individuals, companies, and projects. Secondly is affecting change at the state or local level. And part of the objective of this is really to accrue local knowledge and expertise and use that to achieve this third objective, which is engaging deeply with their investees. We see this through the provision of capacity building support and other forms of technical assistance, as well as just an often more hands-on management style with their borrowers. Part of the objective of this is to increase the impact and also to help maintain a really robust level of financial performance. Shown here are the assets by sector. And so you'll see that the largest sector of this sample is in housing. And so this includes loans for pre-development, development, acquisition, renovation, really across the process. Secondly is looking at community facilities, which includes social services organizations, educational facilities, healthcare facilities, and others that help build robust communities. Third is in businesses, so those with over 5 employees who need startup or working capital or expansion capital. And then lastly is micro enterprises, so very similar to the businesses, but on this much smaller scale, so 5 or fewer employees. And again, we're looking at a lot of different types of impact. So I've shown here the top 6: employment generation, affordable housing, food security, and so on. And there's a lot of different ways that these can come to be through each of these different sectors. So now we'll dig into the performance. The top line, they offer low-risk investment opportunities. And there's a number of different data points that can help support this. So we'll walk through a few right now. The first is we looked at the returns. So the way that these CDLFs are gathering their capital is through investment notes from their investors. And so to understand returns to investors, we looked at their weighted average interest on those notes and found a weighted average of 2.9%. Just to explain a little bit about what we're looking at, this shows us the distribution of returns. So the green is the 3rd quartile, the blue is the 2nd quartile, and then the error bars on either side show us the top and bottom quartiles of performance. The gold diamonds reflect the weighted average mean as well as the simple average. A couple of points from here. First is, again, the weighted average return of 2.9%. It's reasonably low, but held very steady across the 5-year period that we analyzed. The second is looking at this distribution of returns. We're looking at a little over 1% to a little under 4%. That's a very narrow range, which indicates, again, this very strong stability in performance, not too much volatility. We can also understand this low risk in looking at loss provisions outstanding. So overall, we found loss provisions outstanding of 4.9%, but a write-off ratio of 0.6%. So what this means is that they were operating at a lower risk than anticipated, and this held steady across fund sizes. So small, medium, and large funds all had lower write-off rates than anticipated. And then lastly, we tried to understand what's happening next in this market. And we found that over the 5-year period analyzed, these CDLFs grew from $4 billion to $5.6 billion. One thing I'll note is that we are looking at slightly different sizes of the sample, so we also wanted to look at how they're changing at the mean and the median. At the mean, they grew at 5% per annum, and at the median, 12.5% per annum. So by all of these measures, they're continuing to grow, in part a reflection of this really low-risk investment opportunity. So altogether, we came to these main takeaways. The first is they offer stable returns, limited volatility, and a low-risk investment opportunity for investors. And lastly is they're able to affect change across a range of different strategies, looking back to the different sectors and impact themes and the ways that they can help deploy and channel capital into communities around the country. Just to zoom out for a moment, in a separate effort that the GIN has embarked on over the past 1.5 years, we laid out a vision and our roadmap for the future of financial markets. And one of the things that we're really keen to see is a shift from growing impact investing to thinking about the way that we can impact investing. And so what this really means is thinking about the role that all investors have in creating some kind of a positive or negative impact, as Rodney noted. This is really important. It's one where we can borrow from the lessons learned from this community to influence others in the US as well as globally. And so we've laid out this vision, including 6 concrete categories of action that need to be taken to move this market forward, looking at our shared identity, shaping behaviors and expectations, making sure that impact measurement and management becomes a standard and a norm, looking at the range of products that are being offered, and the tools and services that are available to investors and to companies, educating investment professionals as well as businesses, And lastly, thinking about the critical role that policy and regulation play in advancing this market. So I also have some resources available that document that sort of vision for the future as well. So lastly, here's our website. This is a fraction of the data we have available. So please, if you don't want to carry a heavy hard copy, go to the website, download it. You have my email as well in case you have any questions, and I can also take some questions now. Yes.
Where do you see that growth coming from? Government funding, private funding, and then my second question is, where is this magical list of investments that are very promising to expect?
Yeah, great. So I'll answer the second question first. That's easy. These are all Opportunity Finance Network members. And so it's a range of organizations across the US. In terms of the growth, we're seeing a number of different sources of capital. The one that seems to be growing particularly fast is institutional investment and high net worths. But we do have in the report additional breakdown on sources of capital and how that's shifting. Yes. Yeah, so these asset allocations are only among the private debt loan funds. Our annual survey of impact investors also looks at listed equities, venture capital, private equity, and so on. And in the 2017 report, we included a call out on the Community Development Finance Institution community that looks at how that's shifting as well. Yes.
What sectors, you have the sectors listed there, housing, business centers, like, either within those sectors or other sectors, what's trending and what should be expected?
Yeah. Oh, tough questions. I would say that housing is continuously the top sector of investment in this space here in the US. And we find that in this data set as well as in a lot of our other research. So that's definitely one that continues to be quite strong. Otherwise, in the States, we're seeing an ongoing focus in kind of innovative approaches to education. So there's a lot of ed tech, sort of after-school care programs, things like this that are really deep impact and meaningful, and has had a lot of innovation going on. So I think that's one to keep an eye on. I'd say those are probably the main ones. Yes. Hi.
Hi, I wanted to thank Rachel and Jen for really taking the time and making efforts to focus on the divide, and I want to thank a lot of the people that are in this room for agreeing to have the data included in the study. I would also say a couple of things. One that struck me was when you compare the CDFI to the international.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to just
Sure.
comments about that. And then secondly, for those that don't know CDFI, CDFI do a trust arranged investing, so that question about trends. You know, housing is big because housing projects are big and it takes big investment, but there's a lot of small business funding, a lot of small business funding in the room, which is very strong and growing as well, but it doesn't show up quite so big because the dollar amounts that they want to. And in terms of the return, you know, those are typical return plans that they're trying to get from different perspectives. The investments that we advise are making in the communities are paying back, and they are able to pay back to investors at those rates of 2%. There's a lot of questions about how investors actually get into CDFI, and we can talk a lot more about that when we're going to have those programs and institutions that we invest in. And that's the thing we're in the future.
Yeah, I can quickly share kind of the top line findings from the emerging market sample, which is a weighted average return of 2.6%, so actually very, very closely aligned. It's worth noting that the CDLFs are primarily targeting below market rate returns, and the emerging market sample is primarily targeting market rate returns. It's actually a surprising finding for us. They also have a bit of a broader range of returns, so a little bit less stable, although still a very low-risk investment option. And I think it's worth noting, though, that they do often have different structures for where their capital is coming from and the way that their payments are structured, so it's not a perfect comparison. But both segments are included in the report in case you want to see all the nitty-gritty.
So let's thank Rachel.
Great. Thank you.
Rachel, Jen. Thank you, Rachel. Wonderful. I like that, standing up here. Rachel, Jen, and OFN, in fact, for assembling that data. That is very powerful and direct to the point of what we're trying to do today. I will say this to the question about how do we know who those folks are. Remember we talked about on-ramps. So here's one of those on-ramps that you may not have been aware of before of how you can participate. So now let's call our main panel to the stage. We have Lisa Green Hall as our moderator, Bruce McNamer, hey Bruce, Kimberly Cornett, and Bill Bynum, and Carol Thompson-Cole. They are fabulous. Please, please, please look at their bios so you have the context of where their very powerful insights will take you. And Lisa, thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Brian. I'm very excited to be here this morning to moderate what is an exceptional panel. Any one of these individuals could keynote on a national platform. And I have just 4 things that I want to say before we get started with the panel. And we also are going to leave as much time as possible at the end for questions from the audience. So the first thing is just to welcome you and to say, as a member of the City First board, I'm really pleased to see a packed room. Brian, I think we should do this again and get a bigger room. But it's great to see so many people and some familiar faces all here to listen to experts on impact investing. So my first point of order is to welcome you. My second point of order is to underscore some of what was said by Rodney. And I am a huge fan. And I want to be on the record saying, if you have heard of Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you have heard of Charles Blow, this brother is that person in our field. And his stuff is worth reading. It is really powerful, and he is speaking truth to power for sure. His handle, for those who do want to follow him on Twitter, is @RD_Foxworth. And I really encourage folks to use social media. You know, as we think about the future and what's happening with algorithms and blockchain and technology, we need to be engaged in social media. And it's a great way to get information about all kinds of things, but especially about impact investing. There's a hashtag IMP, INV, that's worth following if you want more information than what we're able to share today. And so what I want to underscore that Rodney said is that impact investing is not new. The term is relatively new, but the activities which define impact investing are nothing new. And the fact that City First has been working and lending in communities for 25 years is a testament to the fact that it is not new. So I'd like to keep that in mind as we walk through the day. The third thing I want to share with you is a little bit more around definition. And thank you, Rachel. Some of what I'm going to say repeats what you just heard, but I think there's actually value in repeating what's been said, so folks definitely have heard it. Impact investing is often referred to as a way of doing financially well while also doing good in communities. So doing well and doing good. What does that really mean? And there are 3 elements that the field is using to really define what that means. So one is intentionality, which means you really meant to do something good in a community. That it wasn't incidental, it wasn't by accident, it wasn't just a nice coincidence that your investment had a positive impact, but that when you started, you held yourself accountable to objectives and goals around doing good in the community. The second element of impact investing is that you can measure it, and that you have a commitment to measure it, and that you are measuring both the positive outcomes as well as the negative outcomes. And one of the favorite questions that I've received in my career isn't fracking impact investing? Because it creates a lot of jobs. And it does create a lot of jobs, but it also has a lot of negative outcomes in many communities. And so measurability of measuring both what's happening positively and negatively is a key element to impact investing. And the last piece, just to be clear before we jump into the panel, is you have to get a return of your money, or at least plan to get a return of your money. It is not philanthropy. It's not grant making. Impact investing is actual investment where you expect to get your money back, that you get a financial return alongside a social benefit. So now I'm going to sit down and do my most important job, my fourth point, which is to introduce our panel. And as Bryan said, you have everybody's bios, so we're not going to go into detail. We have to my far left, Bruce McNamer from the Greater Washington Community Foundation, Bill Bynum from Hope Enterprises, Kimberly Cornett from the Kresge Foundation, and Carol Thompson-Cole from Venture Philanthropy Partners. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And I'm going to start to my immediate left and ask Carol Thompson-Cole, one of my heroes from the Washington, D.C. region, to talk a little bit about the work at VPP. And then we're going to come back for a round about examples I'm sorry, if you could talk about your work and examples of impact investing and the work that you're doing to explore it. And then we're going to come back for a round of questions about trends.
Thank you very much for having me. So Venture Philanthropy Partners is a philanthropic investment organization. So we have been doing impact investing, but we don't fit the definitions that everyone talks about today. So we are very intentional about our work. We're focused in Greater Washington, and we really are working on improving outcomes for the most vulnerable youth in our community. And we're focused on it in education, health, and youth development. We're a capacity builder. Everything we've done from the beginning is measurement. We make sure that the work is done on a performance to milestones basis, and we report on what works, and we report on what doesn't work. But we do not provide a financial return. And our investors, we're not looking for a financial return. And I think the biggest challenge for us today is most of our investors are not looking for a financial return, but the prospects and the new investors are. And so it's an area that we're very much focused on in our work. So we're about delivering and helping to create solutions that are facing young people, that are keeping them from being successful in education and particularly to become thriving adults. So we work on building capacity of high-performing nonprofits, but we're working in community now in a collaborative way, and we're identifying high-potential nonprofits to get them to high performance. And we're working across sectors. We really believe that you have to have an ecosystem change to make the difference. If you don't have investments that really make people in community ready to benefit from the thriving economy in your community, you're not doing the job. And so for us, it's about 0 to 24. It's making sure kids are ready for kindergarten, making sure that they're successful at every level, K through 12, that they have the proper credentials to go to work or to go to college. Most of the young people that we're working with, they don't take that direct pathway. They stop and start, but we want to make sure that when they get there and they are ready, and then we have that they can take care of themselves and their families. So when we first started, it was about individual organizations, and then we realized that we needed to build collaborations among nonprofits, and now our work is very focused in going in a particular place and bringing groups together to have even greater outcomes for young people. And so our signature program at the moment is Ready for Work, Champions for Career and College-Ready Graduates of Prince George's County. The county executive invited us into Prince George's. We're working with the school system, with the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and together we are making sure that kids, for starters, in Suitland High School, Oxon Hill, and High Point have the right academic programs, the right career skills and academies within their schools. We're making sure we bring in the best nonprofits and embed them in those schools to provide the wraparound support services that they need, and through the business community that each one of these young people, when they're ready to graduate, they have had a job experience. So we believe in place. We believe that place makes the difference in the long run. We believe in leveraging opportunity. And so right now, we're looking at how we take what we're doing around the region, but also people are coming to us to see if we can replicate this in other places. And we believe our work is very transferable to other communities. So we're in early conversations in Fairfax County now about how do we work along the Route 1 corridor with the government and with the business community. So we're not moving people out of community. We're looking at 43 acres, the old Mount Vernon High School site. How do we create a hub of services for vulnerable families? And how can they stay in their community and move from the housing they're in into market rate housing? All of this is about working for the long haul. And in the District of Columbia, we're looking at setting the collective table or reactivating the table that was set a few years ago to really focus on young men of color.
Thank you, Carol. Kimberly?
Nice to be here this morning. Thank you for the invitation. I echo Lisa's appreciation of Rodney and his excellent words this morning and writing in general, so please follow Lisa's call to action. I run the social investment practice at the Kresge Foundation. We are a national foundation based outside of Detroit. And in 2010, we began a journey to really figure out how we could incorporate impact investing into the foundation's way of operating as a way to accelerate change in the 6 program areas that the foundation works in. And those are arts and culture, health, human services, education, the environment, and our hometown city of Detroit. And you know, coming from not a philanthropic background of investing, I didn't think it could be that hard. You know, these are kind of basic tools. We know how to use them. But I think what I wanted to share with you this morning is that over the years we've learned a couple of things, and we had to kind of learn on the job a little bit. And those were, as we really tried to transition the way that we approach those sectors from an investor that uses multiple tools, we really had to do 3 things. We had to tell the world that we were interested in something other than a grant. I kind of thought when I came to philanthropy, like the deals would just show up on my desk. I would just pick through them and decide what to do. But most people actually, they ask you for what they believe that you have. And so if you don't tell them that you have the capacity to make more than just grants, you're going to continue to see a lot of grants. So we actually spent a fair amount of time marketing the new tools that the foundation had and the new skill sets that we had to actually to understand opportunities from the perspective of both a grant maker and an investor. We really had to work on our system and our staffing. And I love to tell the story of a new markets transaction that we were involved in, the first one. If any of you have dealt with new markets, you know that there are usually some very hard closing deadlines and lots of people trying to arrive in the same place at one time. And we were all set to go until I learned that the foundation only cuts checks on the 15th and the 30th of the month, and this was neither one of those dates. So that made me not a very popular person inside the foundation, but it was an example of how we really needed to start shifting our systems to accommodate a very different type of activity. And then lastly was a culture adaptation. And we had been a traditional philanthropic grant maker for a very long time. And now we were in a very different position of, in some cases, negotiating for not just what we wanted to achieve programmatically, but what we also needed to achieve financially, or what was in the best business interests. We've had to learn over time how to calibrate that financial orientation to make sure that we're really taking on enough risk. You know, my staff largely comes from a traditional financial background. We've all been trained to push risk off on other people throughout our careers. So trying to hold ourselves accountable, have we taken enough risk in this transaction, is something that we're still learning on the job, and many of our borrowers would say that we have more learning to do. So we try to be open to that feedback. I would leave you with this. We made a $350 million commitment to impact investing in 2015. We're about 80% through of deploying that. And one of the things that I think we have learned over time, and I'd ask you, those of you who are considering moving more intentionally into impact investing, is to not overthink it. It's capital. Whether it's $1 of grant, or it's $1 of debt, or it's $1 of equity investment, it's still $1. And trying to figure out how to deploy that dollar in the way that advances the social objectives that you're trying to achieve is really not that hard. But we tend to apply a different standard of rigor to the way that we look at an opportunity when it shows up in the package under investment. So a way that I encourage people to get going so that you don't overthink it is to really think about just basic tools. There are things that actually, if I could roll back the clock, I would do a little bit differently at Kresge. Put some money in a CDFI loan fund. Buy a municipal bond in your local community. Make a deposit in a credit union. And just or a bank, thank you. But often we all get a little geeked out when it looks and sounds like an investment. And I think to get your feet underneath of you, to get your organization primed to become a more nimble, perhaps creative investor, sometimes just doing the fundamentals first and having a positive experience and making a real contribution to your local community can be a way to get going.
And I do want to call out that among Phil's many accomplishments, he used to be the head of the CDFI Fund Advisory Council, which is part of the work that the U.S. Treasury does and represents CDFIs from all over the country. So please share with us your learnings from the Delta.
Thank you. I also used to be the chair of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau when there was a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. You know, there's so many places to start. I'm wearing two hats here today. I am the CEO of HOPE. We are a community development financial institution based in a part of the country that is home to 1/3 of the counties that have had 20% poverty for at least 3 decades, deep entrenched poverty. And if you look at the population of our region, there's no coincidence that it's one of the blackest parts of the nation. We are a credit union, we have a loan fund, and we have a policy institute. And I'm biased, but I think that if a community development organization is not doing policy, if it's not doing advocacy, then it's not doing its job. You know, Rodney's comment about advocacy is just, I think, so spot on. None of us can do this work by ourselves. We've got to influence the resources that have created these disparities and get them lined with the needs of the communities. I think the topic today, impact investing is local, is so appropriate. It is why CDFIs exist. If you're closer to the target, the more likely you're going to hit it. If you're in those communities, you're engaging with the residents and the leaders, and they'll tell you what they need. They're poor. They're not stupid. They know what they need to help their children grow and prosper, what's missing in their communities. And so I think CDFIs do that more effectively than any other type of organization. And so I run a CDFI that works in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. High levels of persistent poverty, high levels of low levels of education, access to health, housing, jobs, and all of those. Poverty is a financial construct. If you're going to solve it, you need to deploy capital where you can close those gaps. And again, CDFIs do that well. I'm also here as the chair of the steering committee of the Expanding Black Business Credit Initiative, EBBC. If you're wondering what that logo is, that's what it is. And you'll be hearing more about it if we do our jobs well. It is a group of 11 CDFI leaders have got together a couple of years ago and have focused on closing the capital gap with regard to black-owned businesses. If you look at black-owned businesses, they've grown at a rapid pace relative to other businesses, 35% versus 2% growth. But when you look at their ability to access capital, 60% of black-owned businesses report having difficulty getting business credit, half of that for non-black businesses. Again, and I think CDFIs, and particularly CDFIs led by people of color, black-led CDFIs, which is the focus of our Expanding Black Business Credit Initiative, we parallel the communities and populations that we serve. We are woefully undercapitalized compared to CDFIs that are not led by people of color. And so we have developed growth plans that show that project how we can increase our lending by 250%. We project 35% annual growth in our lending portfolios over the next 3 years. And of course, we need capital to do that. So we're creating the Black Vision Fund as a means to attract that capital. Impact investors are welcome to see me and my colleagues after this panel and after the forum. But again, I think that we have to be intentional about directing our resources where they can make the biggest impact. CDFIs, underserved communities. My community, the region I serve, has philanthropic investment average $40 per person. You compare that to $450 per person at the U.S. average, $2,000 per person in New York City, $2,000 versus $40. And you wonder why you get the kind of conditions that you have. It is not rocket science. You've got to direct resources where they can have the biggest impact. And CDFIs can do that more effectively. CDFIs led by people of color, serving those communities of color, I think can get you the kind of returns and the change that we're all looking for. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Bruce?
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me tell you a little bit about the Greater Washington Community Foundation. We are the region's community foundation. And as such, we do what community foundations do. We're seeking to build thriving communities right here where we live, right? And so we wear several hats. One of those is trying to mobilize philanthropy, to engage people with means and with an interest in making a difference where we live, and raising money from them to grant out into our community against the whole array of issues that are important to the kind of thriving potential that we have here. And that could be anything from human rights to affordable housing to criminal justice reform to education. And as such, we partner pretty extensively with people who put their monies with us. We have over 700 donor-advised funds sitting at the Community Foundation. And these are essentially small charitable mini foundations, and work with the holders of those funds to help them think about what's the difference I want to make in my community, what are the issues that I care about, and to engage them in a meaningful way with them, to put them together with others, to pool our monies when we can do it, to do just that. We also seek to, and I think part of the point of this panel, to be an advocate for social change in the region, to be a platform for convening, and to take leadership roles ourselves with respect to certain issues. And historically, in the last 10 years, invested a lot of discretionary capital from the Community Foundation in economic security, beginning last year, broadening that aperture, and trying to, and thinking about relevance, thinking about issues like immigration, and now this year in the district, working very closely in partnership with the city and with others to launch later in the year a partnership to end homelessness. So these are examples of the kinds of things that the Community Foundation does. Last year we granted $90 million, most of that right here in our region. In our history, we've granted well over $1 billion here. And I said granted, and that's primarily grants. We've done very little kind of organized, kind of institutional level impact investing. However, we have done impact investing in a more bespoke, customized, one-off way, and that's in the instances where, for example, one of our fund holders may engage with one of our nonprofit partners to put together a loan package. And just an example, 3-4 months ago, a big local provider of services to homeless population, end of a capital campaign, in the final throes of putting together money to finish out the construction of a facility, and they needed bridge financing. So went to one of our donors who had been supportive of them on a grant basis for a long time, and put together $1 million loan just to get them to, over the next 3 years. In that case, it was a zero-interest loan, but with every intention that be repaid. And that is not uncommon for community foundations, is not uncommon for us. However, we are, in the last year, seeking to be much more intentional about making these kinds of opportunities more broadly and institutionally available to our fund holders. So we will later this year, again in concert with our plans around this partnership to end homelessness, be launching our own first impact investing fund, call it. And it will be in partnership with, again, a couple folks in this room, but it's aimed to raise philanthropic capital, private debt, to help in the financing at all stages of financing for permanent supportive housing for folks coming out of homelessness. And while the final deal parameters we're working through, it'll be something on the order of the 2 to 3% returns that you described, and which we expect to be pretty attractive to folks who are fund holders. But again, I think to the point that was made earlier, I don't think we have any illusions about, even as we have very sophisticated donors who in their day jobs and in their regular lives are well accustomed to making investments, it's surprising when you start to have a philanthropic conversation how difficult sometimes it is to get a mentality shift from philanthropy is what you do when you grant to philanthropy maybe what you do when you make a loan to somebody. So I think we have our own kind of marketing and challenges ahead as we do that, but are confident that there's an opportunity here to make a difference. It's an opportunity you all in this room are well aware of with this kind of product.
Thanks, Bruce. And we have about 10 minutes before we open it up to questions, so please be thinking of what you'd like to ask the panel. I'm going to ask Kimberly a question about affordable housing. Affordable housing is a classic example of where an investment, an impact investment, can be used to leverage other types of capital that go into affordable housing. And Kimberly, you have a deep background and experience, your work at Enterprise before landing at Kresge, and also I'm very proud to serve on the Habitat for Humanity board with you, which has its own CDFI. Can you speak a little bit, either examples from Kresge or examples generally, about how impact investing is a powerful tool for affordable housing development?
There are multiple challenges facing our country today, but I think maybe one of the most acute and personal is the shortfall that so many communities are experiencing in the supply of affordable housing. We're actually doing some futuring scenarios right now, trying to understand what direction our social investment work should take in the future. and the crisis really facing the affordable housing space, where projections that we could be looking at upwards of 30 or 50% of the American population not having access to affordable housing is really staggering. You know, the beautiful thing about affordable housing from an impact investor standpoint is that it's easy to understand. We actually know how to finance affordable housing in this country, and there are some really fabulous developers who can deliver a really valuable social product as well as a really stable fixed income kind of financial return. So we have made debt investments directly through CDFIs that finance affordable housing, like CSH and the long-term supportive housing product. We have made equity investments into developers who are creating affordable housing units. And I think if you talk to you know, a bank that is certainly doing similar types of activities. The Housing Partnership Network right now is raising a REIT to capitalize a fund that will go out and buy NOAA housing. NOAA is what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. It's preservation of housing that is does not have any federal subsidy in it, but is by nature affordable for people with lower incomes. So there's a really broad supply of affordable housing that's very easy to invest in, and I think creates kind of a good elementary kind of 101 opportunity for new investors.
Thank you.
Oh, and just to make a pitch for Habitat FlexCap Fund,
Yes.
which is also a really great option.
Thank you. Bill, you touched a little bit about small business lending and small business investing. Can you speak to how that relates to local impact investing, either from funders who've supported HOPE or from the work that you've been doing investing in small businesses in the Delta?
Again, I think that, you know, when you look at the wealth gap, Bryan spoke to the wealth gap here in the DC area, the 7 to 1 net worth gap between white and black households. Well, that decreases to 3% when you look at households led by entrepreneurs of color, and that's a pretty significant fact. That speaks to the importance of black-owned businesses and their impact on their communities. But again, those entrepreneurs have incredible difficulty getting access to credit. When you look at the 7 CDFIs that are part of the Expanding Black Business Credit Initiative, they have track records of doing this. They have, relative to their peers in their communities and to other CDFIs, have success investing in black businesses and keeping the performance at the loss rate on our portfolios is less than 3%. And so one of the things that we're doing is this.
And can I repeat that, less than 3%? Over what time period?
You know, our average, we're in our 25th year, like City First, which is one of the members of the Expanding Black Business Credit Initiative. Collectively, we have long tenures at BFI, so this is not something we just started doing. We've been doing this work for decades, and you know, and so we're really debunking the myth that entrepreneurs of color are high risk. It's a matter of being intentional about investing in these communities and understanding, taking the time. You know, one of the when I first was exposed to private banking, it like blew my mind that a banker would come to you and help you solve your problems, and you know, we didn't even have to go to the bank to make a deposit. You know, this is before mobile banking. Essentially, we are the private bankers for underserved communities. One of the things that we do, in addition to directing capital where it's needed, is providing that problem solving, that technical assistance that, quite frankly, many non-black households take for granted. If you have a lawyer, you know, a cousin that you can call on, or an accountant, then that's technical assistance. When your communities have been extracted from systematically for generations, those opportunities aren't as readily available. And so CDFIs, particularly, again, CDFIs led by people of color who direct their resources into those communities, play that role and fill that gap that otherwise is filled by the natural environment that other entrepreneurs have access to. And so I can't overstate the importance of the investing in these communities. They are drivers of jobs. They are drivers of services. We are financing not just private businesses, but nonprofits, which are a dominant part of the economy in many underserved communities. These communities need service providers, access to healthcare, education facilities, affordable housing developers to fill those gaps. Interestingly, in our region, in Mississippi, which has the largest percentage of black households in the country, there are no black low-income housing tax credit developers that have gotten tax credit from the state. So, and so we have to be intentional. And one of it is access to credit. One is the policy decisions that are made by the people allocating those credits. And so, again, and that's why I speak so, why I say the advocacy is so important. We're demonstrating these investments can be made and produce good returns with reasonable risk. But if we're not intentional about directing those resources, demonstrating that policymakers and banks and foundations can make these investments and get a return that is appropriate, and investments won't be made. Now we are, and it's interesting, particularly in this political environment. Impact investing is local. That's so important because the cavalry is not going to ride over the hill and rescue these communities. We are the cavalry. The cavalry is us. It's these investors, it's CDFIs, and it's up to us to make a difference.
Thank you. Kimberly?
Just follow up, because I think the LIHTC example is so stark, powerful, and sad. And some of you may be familiar with the Opportunity Zone benefit, which was passed as part of the Jobs and Tax Act. And I would just say that because this room is full of influencers, influencing this benefit so that investors recognize that there has to be a return that accrues to both the investor and to the communities in a very material way, so that this benefit is not extractive, and so that not just a handful of coastal places, receive investment through the Opportunity Zone. So I would just encourage folks, we've written a few blogs about how to really think about this program as an investor, asking your manager, what kinds of investments are you making, who will benefit from those investments, what experience do you have working in these communities, because I think that this is, in my personal point, it's a glass half full program. It is an incredible opportunity to drive new capital into places all across the country, but left influenced without boundaries in the regulations around the kind of impact that must be achieved and demonstrated, around the kind of managers who can access it. I think that we're at risk of it.
That's a really important point. And just one follow-on about that. It's parallels with the New Markets Tax Credit Program. Created during the Clinton administration, one of the primary sources of capital to attract, primary tools to attract private capital in underserved communities. But it does depend on who is managing those investments. Mm-hmm. If you look at the returns and the impact of the investments that City First has made with their New Market Tax Credit work, organizations like Hope and other CDFIs, then you see a significant difference. A lot of New Markets Tax Credits, too many New Markets Tax Credit investments have gone into projects that only serve to increase the return on projects that would have gotten financing otherwise. So it's the primary investors that benefit and not the communities. But when you have a mission-driven organization that is driving those investments, then you get the kind of impact that I think the program was intended to achieve. I think we have similar concerns about opportunity zones. And again, CDFIs led by communities of color have the ability to be a conduit between those investors who are looking to take advantage of the tax benefits and the communities that need those investments desperately.
Well, it sounds like a call to action to me for somebody to create an opportunity fund that wants to focus on benefits to the community. I want to give Carol and Bruce an opportunity to talk about their journey and examples of how they're moving along this impact investing spectrum as organizations that primarily do grant making but are really thinking about how to incorporate impact investing to their offerings. Could you speak really briefly? And then do we have a mic for the audience? Are we going to need this mic? There's a mic there. Oh, okay, we're good. All right, so Bruce, after you speak, you have to give up your mic. So why don't you respond, and then we'll end with Carol and go to the audience.
And I think I've described the journey we're on here. That is from being fundamentally and primarily a large grant maker to, as I described it, launching this year, and a grant maker who occasionally on a bespoke and one-off basis did make investments and make loans, to now a point in time where leveraging kind of the potential of returnable capital that can be recirculated back into the not-for-profit community is so powerful. There are models, and I think to the point made earlier, this is not, at the end of the day, rocket science. But I think there is that, as I described earlier, that fundamental shift that we have to kind of evoke for our donors, which is, I'm a grant maker, that's how I think about philanthropy, to another world that they know equally well, even if you have a mortgage, which is, I could lend.
Yeah, and I think we're uniquely advantaged in the greater Washington area to have Bruce at the helm of the Community Foundation. He has served in CEO roles overseas as the head of TechnoServe, a major social enterprise globally, also as the head of JP Morgan Chase's global philanthropy. And so we're very lucky, I think, to have Bruce in this role at the Greater Washington Community Foundation. And then I'm going to give you the last word for this part of the discussion, Carol, to talk about the journey of VPP and impact investing.
So I indicated earlier that we have been investing in outcomes for the most vulnerable youth, and we've been building the capacity of high-performing nonprofits that are really having results in improving those kids' lives. And some of the things that we've learned on our journey that I'd like to put forth for this group that we have to solve together is, one, we understand the potential of financial benefits, but there's a complexity of trying to get social and financial returns. And so one of the things is with Pay for Success social impact bonds, people are requiring measurement. And we've got to build the measurement capacity of these organizations. And so we have to figure out how we pay for that. Investors are always looking for results much faster than the nonprofits can provide those results. Also, when you're working with kids that have intractable problems that they're facing every day, they have a good year and they have a bad year. And when we hit those bad years, we can't say this isn't worth the investment. Also, in many cases, the vehicles that we're looking at now are not integrated well into the traditional capital markets. And then also, there's a lot of money out there, but we don't have the investment vehicles or investments that are ready to go. And so we've got to figure out, as we look at this, and a lot of money is coming in, and it's going to go to where the most vulnerable populations are, we have to figure out what are the protections and what's the intentionality to make sure that we preserve these communities for the people who've been living there and that they deserve to be a part of the success of our community.
Thank you. So this is off. Let's use Bruce's mic for questions from the audience. Yes, the gentleman in the back with the glasses. We're recording, so that's why we're asking folks to
as a socially responsible investor, or financial advisor, I should say, advocacy is something that's important to all of my clients. Bill, who's not in this room that should be? And actually, I think everybody up there would be great to answer that.
No, I think it's an important question. I think it is. Many of the right people are in this room. That's people who care about this enough to pay attention and seek answers. So I think that's really important. But clearly, you have gaps in terms of people's local government and federal government's willingness to pay attention to this work. I see policy as simply how do you influence the flow of resources to benefit the communities and people that we're serving, and so who has the most access to those resources? It's federal and state government, it's banks, it's investment managers, and so I think those are critical audiences. And I think, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get the people in these communities in this room. So it's important for us to be their voice. And again, I think CDFIs play an important role in conveying what their needs are.
Anyone else on the panel want to respond to that?
I'll just add that if they're not in the room, what Bill said is right. You've got to make sure you have their voice. When we go in and work, people find it hard to believe that we are not coming to tell them what to do. We want to hear what they're doing, what they need, and try to advocate for them and bring them together to the right places to get what they need.
Thanks. There are two questions here.
Hi, Kristen Pierre, 20-year veteran of EPA and HUD, and I have a question for the panel, specifically, Kim, for you. You talked about the sort of the lack of deals that were just going to flow through your desk when you showed up at Kresge. One of the things that I'm working on, funded by CERDNA, is looking at how we use the federal government grant programs to pay for pre-development for impact deals. Because one of the things that occurred to me, being a grant manager at EPA and doing that work, was in order for communities and other entities to put out high-performing impact deals that have evidence and data and technical assistance and best practices, they also need time to learn how to do it, and time to make mistakes, time to figure it out. But no one pays for time unless you're the public, federal government. So how do we align those resources, those pre-development things that are needed, so that they're flowing towards projects that actually can end up being, again, high performing, better than 3%. A lot of the environmental work that I did over 18 years had market rate returns, but we never had any mechanism to put those projects towards private capital. So I wonder if the panel could talk about the role of pre-development, the role that grant programs and maybe an impact investing strategy for grant managers to help flow your grants to something that could be investable or financeable down the road.
Kimberly, do you want to take that first?
Thank you for the question. I mean, the public sector is the penultimate impact investor, right? I mean, we can use public resources and do use public resources in many ways today to set the stage for both subsidized capital, philanthropic capital, as well as market rate capital. We just need to do more of it. I mean, I think it's a great call out for a range of investors. I'll give two quick examples. One is actually a DAF. So we did a transaction with the California Community Foundation that was...
and Kimberly, can you just define what a DAF is?
Donor advised funds. I'm a novice versus the expert. But these are kind of like mini foundations that individuals can establish. They get an immediate tax benefit for making a contribution to a DAF. DAF can sit in perpetuity, or it can be granted out or invested out over time. And there is a tremendous amount, I mean, $1 trillion, it's an enormous amount of capital that somebody has already decided is going to be used for philanthropic purposes. So we did a transaction with the California Community Foundation, who was trying to mobilize their DAFs into impact investing. And those funds were being used to invest in a fund managed by the Corporation for Supportive Housing to provide pre-development loans to developers who were trying to develop new supportive housing units in LA in response to the public sector call out, essentially, of a homelessness crisis in LA. So that was kind of one example. What we did essentially was to guarantee a portion of the DAF principal coming back to the account in the event of a loss. The other example I would give is some pre-development grant funding that we have provided to the state of Washington to help them to develop their own opinion via research and data, but also kind of strategy for how to use pay-for-performance structures around Medicaid. So the particular example here is a group intervention for high-risk moms, and the state is trying to figure out how and if they can use Medicaid funding to essentially pay for that, very strong evidence base that intervention saves Medicaid money in the long term. So those are just two examples of how we've seen impact investors kind of seed future transactions, but a total call out to the public sector to do more of it.
Bruce?
No, that's right. And I'm afraid I can't answer your primary question, is how do we get the federal government to do that? But another source of that kind of flexible capital is obviously philanthropic, right? And as I described, our partnership and homelessness, there's a big impact investment component to that, but there is a side-by-side grant component, a lot of that around the coupling of financing with technical assistance, however you get it, is often critical to making those loans work. And in the instance of pre-development lending, I think lots of ways you can invest there, but certainly something we're focused on is helping build the capacity of the nonprofit developers themselves, specifically with some grant funding coupled with a separate revolving loan fund just for pre-development lending.
Go ahead, Bill.
Just one point is probably not the answer you were looking for, but one of the ways that you can influence policymakers to make these investments is to get people to vote. Interestingly, our policy center has done some analysis, and people who are banked, 65% of our members either didn't have a banking account or were underbanked and relying on payday lenders and check cashers. 90% though of our members now are registered voters. People who have a banking account are more likely to vote. They're more likely to go to their city council meeting. They're more likely to tell people, so we don't have to be the conduit for their voices. People who are homeowners are more likely to vote. And so this financial inclusion, the work that we're talking about fostering and stimulating with this impact investment, translate directly into a more engaged population. And so, again, that's how this changes. And policy is, inequality is not inevitable. It's policies reflect our priorities, and so we need to get people in positions that reflect the priorities of these underserved communities.
Absolutely. Okay, let's give some love to this side of the room, and then we'll come back to the question over here. Yes, gentleman right there.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Anthony Allen. I'm actually from New Haven, Connecticut, so I'm not a part of the DC proper community in that way, or at least geographically. But I wanted to challenge something really quick, actually, because there's been a lot of conversation over the last 5-10 years, especially, about impact investment. And we've seen the statistics go up every year about how much money is being transitioned into impact investment. But what's also becoming clear is that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think it was you, Lisa, that brought up fracking being impact investment.
No, not being impact investing.
Right. but how you could frame it that way,
yeah,
right?
Yes.
And so my question is, as you're starting to think about or see funds come into your organizations and you're setting up new funds, how can we start to think more deeply about what impact means? So yes, we're creating jobs in minority communities, but a job for what? And where does that go? And yes, we have units of affordable housing. Okay, affordable housing for what? Where does that go? Right? Because, in our community, we're having a lot of conversations about inclusive growth, driven by our community foundation, actually. And one of the things that keeps coming up is, yeah, we keep talking about how many jobs we need. We need to create jobs. And then we celebrate when we create those jobs and they pay $11 an hour. And they don't really go anywhere. And so how can we start to think more deeply, and how are you guys approaching that?
So I do want to ask the panelists to respond, but I will also react to this because I think it is a really important point as the field grows and attracts mainstream participants. So there are venture capital private equity groups like KKR and the Partners Group and BlackRock who have now launched what they call impact investing funds. And so it does become incumbent on the community to hold folks accountable, but also to those of us in institutions that can influence impact investors to really hold them accountable around measurement, and not just measurement of outputs, which are jobs, which are how many people were served by a clinic or how many students were educated in a school, but also to hold them accountable to outcomes. Was it a good job? Did it actually increase the wealth or the income for that family? Was the student who went to the school, did they actually learn anything? Did the person who goes to the health clinic, did they actually get better? Right? Like, those are the things that we should care about as impact investors. And I do think that there are efforts underway to push the field overall towards more outcome measurement, and the Global Impact Investing Network, which Rachel represents, has been doing some work around that. But I know your question was to the panelists about what they're doing within their organizations.
So I'll start by saying that we're doing much more work in a collaborative way and have all sectors represented at the table to really look at what the issue is. We spend a lot of time talking about outcomes. We also talk about what the common outcomes framework is that everybody's working toward to go deep in that community to get the results that are requested. And then we play the backbone role to keep them focused and driven to get to those results.
I think there's almost a tangential but issue here, and that is the limits of market interventions and where the public good and subsidy are vital, because the market mechanism doesn't get you there. And I think we all need to be very explicit about that as you talk about impact investing. And just in the instance you cited, yeah, the market might not get you to a living wage in that instance. And so we, as in partnership with our impact investment colleagues, we've got to take that on. I think that speaks to the power of public-private partnerships and to the real power of market mechanisms for unleashing capital, but also kind of incentives for efficiency and for real, delivering programs efficiently, but at the same time aren't going to get you all the way there. And I think constructively in that context about where the public subsidy is necessary and ends, and market and the limits of markets interventions, but where they can actually augment, augment that.
Okay. So I think we have time for 2 more questions.
One more, I'm afraid. One more great question, I'm afraid.
Okay. I think she was holding her hand up for a little bit longer, but we are also going to have an hour of networking.
Yes.
So there'll
yes,
be plenty
indeed.
of opportunity to ask your questions to panelists directly.
My name is Marla Dean, and I'm the Executive Director of Bright Beginnings, and we run early childhood and adult learning centers for homeless children here in D.C. And if you don't know, there's 2,700 children under the age of 6 homeless in D.C. And I want to thank City First because they have made an investment in us with the new market tax credit, and they helped us through that process. My question is, when you ask the question, who's not in the room, when I was listening to everyone, I don't think that many nonprofit leaders are in the room. And so as a traditional nonprofit, how do we begin to reposition ourselves? When you gave the definition of what social impact is, and it's a return, a financial return, and by definition we're a nonprofit, how do we provide a financial return in doing this work when we're talking about a movement toward social impact investment?
So not everything that creates a social return can be financed. And I think, to Bruce's point about the limitations of impact investing, there are some things that don't generate revenue and therefore are not appropriate for impact investing. But wherever there is a revenue stream, including revenue that comes from government contracts, which I presume that Bright Beginnings would fall into that category. Where there is some type of revenue stream over time, that can be financed, and it is appropriate for impact investing. And I think that nonprofits have to begin to think about the fact that even though they're not making a net profit, they are generating revenues often that can be financed. And so I'm looking at our clock. We have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to that great question and also to share with us any final thoughts that they want to leave with the audience today. Carol, can you start us?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can really add to the answer that you gave, but because we have invested so much in nonprofits, we're really trying to figure that out. So we don't have an answer today, but it's going to be a real challenge for us as we go forward to continue to build capacity of organizations.
I wanted to respond just quickly to both questions. I think a risk of the acceleration of impact investing is that we want everything to be an impact investment. And the work that you do may not be suitable for it, but it makes it no less important than something that is financeable. And I think that because there is this growing interest in things that take debt, things that take equity. I don't want that to consume the incredible work that are done by service providers such as your organization that need to be robustly supported by public sector dollars and by philanthropy. Because, I mean, you are shepherding the most important impact investment that our society has, which is our children. And then just to the question about measurement and that the gentleman asked previously, I just wanted to note some of the work that we're doing around opportunity zones is trying to align ourselves with wealth managers and banks that are going to be trying to pull in these new investors who are attracted to the tax benefits of Oz. And what we are trying to do to ensure that there is meaningful social impact created through these investments and not just a tax sheltering strategy is to provide a partial guarantee from our foundation to funds that will adopt some sort of baseline social measurement, whether that's affordability, living wage jobs, not just service jobs where people are going to drive for 45 minutes to try to get there. Because we really feel, one, that it's an important signal to investors that they should really be digging down to the kinds of investments that are going to be made and to the impact that they're going to have in communities, but also hopefully to fund managers that they should really be prioritizing those investments that are going to create lasting wealth and value in communities.
You know, we're talking about making deep systemic change in communities that have been disenfranchised, disrespected, and just dismissed for generations. And that's not going to happen. You're not going to go from 0 to 60 overnight. I think it's appropriate that we're focusing on impact investing. It is a great opportunity to direct investment into these communities. But as you said, it's been said, everything is not, can't be financed and shouldn't be financed. But we couldn't make City First couldn't have made that new markets investment if you hadn't done the work that you'd done, the pre-development work. And that pre-development work often requires subsidy. It requires grants. And so impact investment alone is not going to get the job done. We've got to mix that with philanthropic resources, with public resources, and make sure that these communities that have been extracted from and not been invested in, that we close those gaps. And that's impact investment is a part of that. And I also think it's important not to overcomplicate this. I think we are all sometimes tend to overanalyze this work. For me as a lender, it comes down to betting on leadership. When the plan doesn't go according to plan, are they going to make the adjustments that are needed to keep things on track and to repay my loan? When you make an impact investment, are you betting on someone who has a track record of doing this work that is anchored in these communities? And I think that's one of the things we need to keep in mind. Let's not overcomplicate it. See, look at what organizations have done and equip them to get the scale, because these communities, these CDFIs led by people of color, are underinvested in, what could they do if they had adequate investment and could do it at scale?
Bruce?
I can't add much to that except to say that there is a little bit of this sort of the tyranny of this big idea, which has nonprofits who have been fantastic work for a very long time trying to contort themselves into somebody else's definition of what impact investing is. And that's, we see it with our grantees. I think about VPP, which was the pioneer in impact, I think, in this region in terms of a new approach. And it's not about financial return, but it's about intentionality, it's about measuring for impact, it's about holding kind of their nonprofit partners accountable, even as they do it with great respect and a spirit of partnership. And now that language has somehow been appropriated in ways that, it's like, well, but wait a minute, we've been doing this for a long time. So I don't know what the answer to that is, except to proudly step up and say, this is how we intersect with the market, but let's talk about what we're doing.
Yeah, gotta love it. This is a lot for us to talk about over the networking. I think my next job is to hand it over to Bryan, but before we do that, let's give a warm round of applause to our panel.
So I'm not going to close us out with a lot of words, but I do hope we delivered, City First Foundation delivered on what we promised you, and that was to bring this kind of dialogue, these kinds of ideas, data, so that you can take something home and do something with it. And figuring that out, in part, will be your job as you go into the reception and meet with folks and get a little bit more data. A couple things I wanted to just acknowledge. First, at City First, we've been using that term generally, but it's come up in different contexts, so it reminded me I should probably explain a little bit. There's a few different entities that I'm going to ask the directors who really have brought this to you to stand in just a moment. But this is hosted by City First Foundation, which is a 501c3 dedicated to this kind of work, advocacy, convening, bringing folks together to come up with concrete ideas that can be executed on. That's our charge, specifically for our local community. Excuse me. We also have City First Bank, which is a CDFI. And with City First Bank, we've talked about some of the different sectors. We focus on really three. Affordable housing, developers, and investors, for-profit and nonprofit. Secondly, we focus on small and medium-sized businesses, including and intentionally focusing on minority-owned businesses and African-American and women-owned businesses as well. And then third, nonprofits, including our new markets practice, so that they can, as you have done, increase their impact and deliver actually with a financial vehicle. So that's at the bank. And then we also have a nonprofit loan fund, also a CDFI, that provides that earlier at-risk capital or the subordinate risk capital that might be necessary. You need a lot of tools to do this work. And we also have City First Homes, which focuses on permanent and long-term affordability and housing. So we're trying to bring a lot of different tools to the table to partner with you to be effective in some of the things we talked about. If I can get the directors who are in the room for any of the City First entities just to stand so that we can acknowledge your work and contribution to this. Thank you all. I'm going to go back because our participants today, wow, they have challenged us, they have informed us, they've told us what they're struggling with and what they're doing well and what we need to be doing. And so I want to acknowledge them by name, each of them bringing something very powerful to the table. Rodney Foxworth, thank you. Rachel Bass, Lisa Hall, losing my name, Kimberly Cornett, where's Kimberly? There she is. Bill Bynum, Carol Thompson Cole, and again, when we do these things, oh, Bruce McNamer, my goodness, and you as well, Bruce. When we do these things, we also know that many of you in the audience, this is how we try and build the room, could also be panelists because you have that level of expertise. So thank you all for that piece and for participating and contributing. Let's give them a round of applause again. Back to City First for a minute. These things don't happen certainly by my efforts, or by just ethers. There's lots of folks at City First who help bring an event like this together. I want to acknowledge a few who have really done some amazing heavy lifting to make this possible. Again, first I will acknowledge Director Lisa Hall, thank you. Gloria Naughton, Cynthia Newell, and Catherine Harper, Eugene Kim as well. This is the City First team that produced this event for you and brought it together, so thank you. And we do talk about private, public, nonprofit partnerships a lot at City First and in this room as well. Another piece of that that's important are folks who write checks, who underwrite activities. So again, the sponsors and partners are listed, but we really do want to thank them once again for enabling us to bring this type of forum to you. So thank you to our sponsors. And finally, but we need an applause for that. These are some folks. All right, let's get an applause for that. So I mentioned this is a series. The next Impact Forum that we will be holding this fall is all around affordable housing, an area that many of us focus, and as you mentioned, Rachel, one of the areas of very high impact in delivery. We'll be doing it on Wednesday, October 24th. We'll be at the Anacostia Arts Center, which is wonderful in Southeast Washington, returning there for City First. It'll be 8:30 to 2. And again, we'll have a similar format, a little bit more time with the panel discussions, a bigger room. Who said that? Lisa. Bigger room, perhaps, breakout sessions. Actually, we'll have an awards reception there. Go to cityfirstfoundation.org to register. Again, as you can see, we do run into capacity problems. To be honest, even when we have a larger room, we had 400 people and others who couldn't get there. So I don't think they build a room large enough. But we are also live streaming, and in this case, I think we're on Facebook. And don't forget to tweet out messages and thoughts that you had from today. All right, let's go get a little food, a little coffee, and most importantly, seek out, interact with each other, and start designing some solutions to improve our community and close these gaps a little bit. Thank you. Very much appreciated.